Okay, welcome back. So now we're going to keep moving on. Now we're going to talk about your immune system and how it develops. So this lecture is going to focus on innate immunity. So you're going to see that you're going to have different lines of defense. And we're going to talk about that first line today. So let's get into it. So what's the purpose of your immune system? It's actually a lot more complex than you really would think. And honestly, it's kind of daunting when you read the chapter. So don't freak out. I understand, especially the next lecture is going to be kind of overwhelming, but just focus on the smaller things and what's the big thing that, everyone is doing together ultimately is to protect your body from infection and also cancer outbreaks too. We only think about our immune system and fighting against viruses and bacteria, but cancer is another one too. Now, pretty much an infection is when any intruding organism that enters your body. It can compose of bacteria, it can be from parasites or viruses. It also this problem can happen when we have cancer. So this is when your own cells are mutated. So if you remember, if you took me for 14.0, we talked about oncogenes and proto-oncogenes, and then how it's like the gas and brake pedals of the car, and how when the cell cycle goes out of whack, it just keeps dividing rapidly, and that's what causes these cells to divide over and over again, and eventually that leads to a mass of cells, which is called a tumor. Now, you do have your immune cells that are going to operate in your blood. They also operate within your lymph node fluids, and but you're going to see that together you have these cells constantly patrolling your body to kind of maintain and keep the status quo. So this lecture talks more about your innate immunity. So you have immunity that you are actually born with. You have your physical immune system, there's a chemical one, and then you have cellular defenses. Now, goal is to prevent the spread and movement of foreign pathogens throughout your body. And there's a whole wide range of different ways that it's going to prevent that. But, you have a status quo, and you want to make sure you keep the invaders out. Now, we need to make sure that, there's going to be all kinds of different pathogens that you're exposed to. And, sometimes new ones will come around, but sometimes the same ones will keep coming back. And that's what's great about your immune system is it recognizes that it's already been here. And especially your adaptive immune system is going to go through and have the defenses ready for when that pathogen that it's seen before comes. Now, if it's a new pathogen, you're going to have two initial lines of defense. So your first line of defense is like your intact skin and your mucous membranes. Think of them as barriers. So, your normal skin, it's all nice junctions and everything, all kept together. Now, when you get a cut or something, they try to tell you to keep the cut closed, keep it clean, keep a bandage on it. The main goal is to prevent the possibility of bacteria and other things getting into a cut so that it can get past that initial skin barrier and cause problems. You also have your mucous membranes. Think about all the ones in your nose and all the other stuff and how it catches all these different pathogens and stuff. The goal is to catch it at the first line. If we can catch it there, then there's less of a chance that it's going to go through and get later on in your body. Now, that's your first line. Your second line of defense is the chemicals, cells, and proteins. So you have chemicals like you naturally secrete that you don't realize that are actually doing a good job. So you have lysozyme in your tears. You have a lot of acid actually in your sweat and sebum. And then in your stomach, it's a very acidic environment. Not much can survive there. So, the goal of stomach is to provide an environment that can possibly kill out some harmful bacteria, but sometimes some do get past that. Now, you do have a line of cells that we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail later, called your phagocytes, your macrophages, your neutrophils, and NK cells, and these are going to do a good job. Their goal is to go to that infection and start killing the cells, mopping up, eating the bacteria. There's all kinds of different things. And then you have proteins. You have a complement system that's going to go through and kind of help with these first two, the chemicals in the cells when it comes to fighting infections. So let's talk a little bit more about that first line of defense. So as I mentioned, you have your skin and everything is held together, those epithelial cells, by those very tight junctions. They keep it like there so you can't let anything through. Now, as I mentioned, on your skin and those mucous membranes secrete chemicals that are kill or actually weaken the bacteria. This is like the first thing. If you can catch them there, that's the goal. Now, as I remember, once they can get past that, they have to try to get past that tight layer of tight junctions of your epithelial cells. And that's why we keep them so close together. So remember, those tight junctions allow nothing to get through. Now, within your respiratory tract, that kind of goes along with this mucous membranes, you have those ciliated cells, and with the mucus, and what it does, it traps and removes virus particles and bacteria. So think of conditions like, especially if you go into a dusty environment, how you blow your nose and you see tons of dirt, or you're coughing. It's kind of because those cells are indicating it's like, okay, we're catching things we shouldn't. These are bad. We got to get rid of them. As I mentioned, the pH of your stomach is really important for killing many bacteria. You don't realize it, maybe you left those leftovers out a little too long. Bacteria can divide rather rapidly. Remember, their generation time is about 20 minutes for some of them. So think about how fast a colony can grow. Well, the goal of your stomach, if you decided to eat that, it might taste fine, but maybe the low pH in your stomach will actually kill that population. Now, as I mentioned, you do have some populations that are beneficial to you. When I talked about bacteria a long time ago, you have them in your large intestine, and for the vagina for ladies, that's a good colonies. You want those, and they're like kind of have their own defense mechanisms, and you want to make sure that you have those colonies because they kind of keep the status quo. Now, when the pathogens overcome both your chemical and your physical barriers, that's when your immune system has to respond. So this is when you start to see the conditions that kind of make you feel ill, like with the inflammation, the fever, and all the other stuff. That is an indication that your immune system is actually activated and doing its job. You probably won't feel most of this first line stuff, your first and second line of defense. This is pretty much going on all the time. It's not till when those two lines get penetrated and we get into the third line where we're having to actually fight and get the immune system activated that you start to feel those conditions. And that's just us, indicating it's like, hey, your immune system is trying to work and, get rid of that pathogen. So this goes to this question, how do you know what's an invader? What's a bad guy? We need to make sure we can identify which particles are foreign. Think of all the different types of cells in your body, and how does your body know like one cell from the other? As I mentioned, there's like glycoproteins, and I kind of call those like little billboards that cells use to identify themselves and kind of communicate with each other. So we need to have a way to identify within our body what are self cells and our non-self cells. So we use proteins and other molecules that are made of our cells and attached to our cells, to our bodies, say, hey, this is normal, this is me, don't target this is normal, I'm supposed to be here. Now what we're going to be doing is looking for complexes that are not self and use that to our advantage when it comes to fighting them. So we look for these complexes on bacteria, viruses, and parasites, sometimes pollen and dust, other chemicals. And we want to make sure we recognize those things and say that's non-self. And we want to make sure we recognize it early so we can form that line of defense. If we need to activate our B and T cells, we can do that early on. So here are some keywords that you might see show up later on. Antigens. This is anything that causes the immune response. It can be entire pathogens or just some of the proteins that they express. You're going to see that there's going to be markers on the outside of these bacteria, these viruses. What we're going to use is be able to recognize these markers so we can say, okay, I know that's bad. We need to make sure that anytime we see that, we recognize it and knock it out right away. Now, these can be general markers or specific for certain types of viruses or bacteria. Another keyword is cytokines. So these are molecules used for cell signaling. As I mentioned, your cells do talk to each other. They have to be able to communicate. See, especially when you get to the B and T cells, they are going to communicate with each other. One's going to tell the other one about this, and then that's going to activate it to go through and do this next part. So cytokines are like a way of cell communication. And then there are chemokines. These are like a type of cytokine, and it's released by infected cells. You know, it's like a red light danger cell. And sometimes these chemokines will be released. Sometimes the cell realizes like there's no turning back. It's bad. I need to be killed by a natural killer cell or something like that before the virus is able to replicate and actually release more copies of itself. So we talked about blood a little bit when we talked about the part of when it came to your circulatory system, and you talked about the red blood cells and the plasma, but we're going to focus mostly on with your immune system, the white blood cells. I call them the WBC Crew. It's quite a few. I know it looks kind of scary, but I have it broken up into different slides what each of their jobs are. Now, just looking at this picture, you can see they're very large compared to the blood cell. Remember, the red blood cells, the goal was to carry the oxygen, carbon dioxide, and more help with the gas exchange. Now these guys are going to be larger and they're going to be nucleated, so they're going to have that huge nucleus. And they're able to move. And what's unique about these is, guys, they can actually leave the blood and go into infected tissues. You might have heard them called leukocytes. That's another term that we use to call the white blood cells. So let's talk about some of them in a little bit more detail. So the first one is the basophil. Now he's a small amount when compared to everyone else. It only counts for about 1% of all your white blood cells. Now these are going to be important for mounting a non-specific immune response. So sometimes, you know, some pathogens are going to have this general marker, and we're going to have to form a defense. Especially multicellular parasites. They don't have the specific markers that we're used to recognizing. This is where the basophils really come in. But one of their key roles is with asthma. Think about there are certain things that just trigger it for certain people. Now, what they're going to do is they're going to be releasing histamine, among other chemicals. And what that does is it kind of causes an immediate response of inflammation. And with asthma, it causes that vasoconstriction in the airways. So not a big guy right there, but they are responsible for a lot of immediate responses. Probably one of the big guys that does a lot of the work are what we call our neutrophils, and they make up about half of your red blood cells, or sorry, your white blood cells. Sorry, just misspoke there. Now, normally these are going to be the first guys there, and what their job to do is to go through and first response, and they try to eat the invaders as quick as possible. So they know it's like, hey, that's not supposed to be here. Let's try to get rid of them. They're ferocious eaters, and this is a video showing a neutrophil actually engulfing a bacteria. So, as I mentioned, they're the first responders, so they're going to try to get as much of the invaders as possible, but then they're also going to send out signals. And those signals are going to alert the other parts of the immune system to respond to the scene. So these are your first guys you're really going to see there. And they're going to try to do as much as possible, but they can only do so much. You might have seen these guys before, as I reminded you before. When you get infections, one side effect that you do have is pus. And this is due to the neutrophils, the ones that were there and the ones that have died. Now, what's unique about these guys, they are released from your bone marrow, and they only live for about 8 hours. So you're producing these all the time, every day, because of their short lifespan. Now, your next one is the eosinophil, and these are going to also have a key role in fighting bacteria and responding to some infections with parasites. Now, what they do is they actually secrete some toxic proteins to actually kill bacteria and parasites. So instead of engulfing them, they actually release some chemicals that actually kill them. Now, the bad part about that is it also can kill the normal healthy cells around that. So we need to make sure that we regulate. You want to make sure that these guys are not hyperactivated, because yes, they're releasing the the chemicals to help kill, but it's also could be killing healthy tissue. Now, these guys are especially problematic when it comes to allergy symptoms. So they like to go overboard, if you ever have allergic responses and stuff, you can think of to this type of cell. What they do is they just go mount an immune response to something like pollen, example. And what they do is they just release so many of these signals, and your body just kind of goes over well with the immune response and histamine and all that other stuff. So they're not too complex. There's only about 5% of your white blood cells, which is good because they can be quite harmful if they're not kept in check. All right, your next one is your monocyte, and it kind of goes along with the macrophages. That's why they're kind of kept together. I always think of these as the garbage trucks of the immune system. About around 10% of your bloodstream, and what they do is just to go and clean up the dead cells. That's their job. You know, they're the cleanup crew. Yes, we talked about how the first ones get there and they kind of eat as much as possible, but you know, at the end you got to come up and clean up the mess. This is for the monocytes. Now, when monocytes differentiate, they become what we call a macrophage. So this is a large cell that's going to engulf foreign particles and pathogens. So he shows up later and he's going to clean up blood cells, dead tissue, and other cellular debris. And then he also, in the process of doing that, he's going to release more chemicals to make more white blood cells. So sometimes, you know, we need to make sure it's like he gets there and it's like, okay, I'm going to need some additional help. They release those cytokines, which are, you know, the signals that cells communicate to each other. It's like, hey, we need a little bit more. Last up is the lymphocytes. You'll break them up into B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes. We call them B cells and T cells. Now, these are going to originate from your stem cells in your bone marrow, and where they mature determines the type they're going to be. They're going to mature in either the thymus or the bone marrow. Now, we'll break them up into smaller groups. That's why I say immune system can be quite daunting when you look at it. You're going to see we're going to have our B cells, we'll have memory cells and regulatory cells, and for our T cells, we have all this lineup right here. We have killer cells, helper cells, regulatory cells, memory cells, natural killer T cells. We'll go over this in the next lecture. Freak out. Even I, you know, having to reteach myself this chapter every time I teach this course. So let's introduce a few of the other guys that play a role in your innate immune system. So first up, we have mast cells, and this is the best picture I could find. I tried to find like actual images of some of these, and what they do is they produce inflammatory molecules like histamine that we talked about before in response to large pathogens. They're going to be very important because they're going to dilate the blood vessels, and that's going to induce inflammation. Now, the reasons we dilate is so we can get more of the cells that we need to that area. You're going to find these cells a lot in your mucous membranes and your connective tissue. So these cells are permanently there, and they're kind of like one of your first things that you're going to encounter. They're always there, and once they know something's bad, they kind of do some of the initial response. Now, tumors in dogs is a big thing. Most of the time, you'll notice that the mast cells are what's going to be causing them. So as I mentioned, there's a few of the other guys that we need to talk about. We'll talk about natural killer cells a little bit, but these they kill host cells in order to stop an infection. So sometimes, you know, as I mentioned when I talked about viruses, the only way a virus can actually go through and replicate is it has to take over a host cell. Well, when the host cell realizes like, okay, this is bad, I'm going to die anyways, but we need to take care of this early on before the virus is actually able to make copies of itself, it's going to send out signals and say, hey, I need an NK cell to come and, you know, finish me off. Now, how we identify that is we look for the expression of these major histocompatibility class markers, and we'll see class 1 and class 2, and these are put on the surface of cells, and I kind of called it like a billboard, you know, because remember we have those cell billboards that kind of tell you like type of cells and how we are. Well, these MH1 class molecules, they're just proteins, and they inform the cells on the internal environment. So if it's unhealthy, we got to give this altered billboards like, hey, there's a problem, I need to be killed off, and that process of cell, you know, is called apoptosis. And then we have scanner cells that are kind of patrolling the body looking for these sick cells with those NK cells. So they look for those billboards. I know this is a funny one, but they look for those sick billboards on cells and kind of then go through and get rid of those, hopefully preventing the viruses from actually making complete viral particles. Like another cell that you might see that has a role in your innate system is called a dendritic cell. So what these are going to do is prevent antigens on their surface. So they kind of have these little like bridges that they go out, and they can actually go into the lumen and kind of like survey what's going on out there. Now what they do is they're present in your epithelial tissue, and they have this contact with the external environment. And what they do is they kind of look for threats. You know, they're just kind of scanning it. If you want to think of it like a submarine, here's a periscope going up, and he's kind of checking what's all going on out there. So he kind of serves as a bridge between the innate and the adaptive immune system. So he's kind of surveying the first rounds. If he notices anything going on, he's going to recognize that, and he's going to alert some of our B and T cells that we talk about in the next lecture. So let's talk a little bit about, how this immune response happens. And here's the inflammatory response. So think about, you have a cut, boom, boom, boom. Just a little, you could be a big paper cut, big cut, whatever you want to think about. You're going to have fluid rush to the site of infection because you have those mast cells. They're permanently located in here. They're not shown here. But what they're going to do is they're going to cause release of histamine. And what that's going to cause is damaged tissue, causes the capillaries to dilate. And that's going to allow tissue fluid to come out. All this is happening in this area. This is going to cause a fluid buildup, and it's going to cause the redness, heat, and swelling and pain. Now we're increasing blood flow to this area because we need to get the right cells to there. And we're also pressing on the nerves. That's why you feel pain when you get these cuts in these areas and the inflammation. First off, we're going to get some of our white blood cells. The macrophages arrive, and they start to engulf pathogens. They're going to chomp, 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 start to ease these up. And they first off, they're trying to get there, eat up what they can, but they also need to identify them. Now, this is where your neutrophils arrive early and engulf and digest pathogens. And then afterwards, the macrophages are a little slow to get there. They might show up a little later, and they'll help and clean it up. Now, the leukocytes, remember, just another term for your white blood cells, they're going to be here too. Some of them are going to be surveying. What they're going to do is we're going to recognize some of these signals. And if it's a pathogen you've experienced before, it might then go and activate your B and T cells. Or if it's not, we need to kind of prime the cells to get ready for the next response. So it's a big process. I just want to appreciate, like, when first things happen, you have a whole first line of defense that comes, like the first line of cells that come, and then once they try to control what they can, if not, then we're going to trigger the adaptive immune system. So in accordance with all that other stuff, we do have a complement system, which is just a bunch of type of proteins. Their job is to basically destroy these extracellular pathogens. It works in sync with the innate immune system, and these are made by cells in your liver and some macrophages, and pretty much they flow in blood system and they can respond immediately. It's just another way that we can enhance engulfment of certain cells of pathogens. So this is just another way. I know the book talks briefly about it, but I'm not going to ask Carly any questions on it. So some review videos. I know it was kind of daunting because there's a lot of information, but like I said, just what's the job of each type of cell? And remember, you do get to use your notes on the test. And there's my slides.